Well, hello, and welcome to Joshua number 3. In our first message in this series, we were reminded how that we found Jesus in the first 5 books of the Bible. But then in that number 1 message, we talked about the need to now start following Jesus. And one of the things that we mentioned, yes, there will be obstacles, but God also promised that he would never leave us nor forsake us. In our second message, we talked about facing the incredible. You know, the plan that God's going to lay out for them to take this whole promised land is pretty incredible. But God encouraged them to promote the plan, to follow that plan, and prepare to follow that plan. So that's what we want to encourage you to do too. Now, in this message, in Joshua, we're going to be looking at the second chapter from verse 1 to verse 24. But we can't read all of the passage, so I encourage you, if you're online listening to this, then maybe pause and read for yourself the whole chapter. Get a gist of what's really going on, of Rahab, or really I should stop and say Joshua, sending out the spies, and then them landing in Rahab's home, and her being chased, or they being chased by the king. He sent men after them. Rahab hides them, and then after she tells them they've already left and you better hurry up and go out and pursue them, they run out. And as soon as they do, then we come up to the verses 9, 10, and 11 that we're going to look at. And what we're going to see, though, through Rahab, is that this is a revelation of God's grace. Now, I don't want to spoil it by giving you a lot of things beforehand. Let's at least read those 3 verses first. But we want to spend some time looking at these verses, and again, remind you, read the whole chapter. But look at what we find, and this is absolutely amazing of who Rahab was, where she was at, what she was doing, everything about her, and what's going on with this plan of God. It's like he takes a little break from the children of Israel and includes a Gentile in his plan of redemption. And this is truly one of the most wonderful revelations of God's grace that you'll ever see. After, again, she goes up to make sure that, and tells them what's going on, and that she's going to make them wait a while before they get out and let them down the window. She says this, she said unto the men, I know that the Lord Jehovah hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord, again, Jehovah, dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what ye did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord, Jehovah, your God, your Elohim, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. Again, this sermon is about God's grace revealed from and through an unlikely resource, Rahab, and of course the 2 spies who brought her the opportunity to confess her faith in Jehovah, the God of heaven. I emphasize that name, Jehovah, because it's 4 times that she uses the word Jehovah, not the pagan God that she knows about. She gave witness about how she had already heard about Jehovah and that he was the supreme God, the only sovereign God. She gave witness, Rahab did, to her faith that it was Jehovah God who dried up the Red Sea for Israel. She gave witness that she had heard and believed it was God who gave Israel to destroy the Amorites, take their cities, and to dwell in those cities. So we're focusing on Rahab. And what we're going to see by that, and I'll explain each one of the words that I use here, but we're going to look how that this revelation of God's grace comes through Rahab, and we will see how that Rahab was changed by God's grace. We will see how that Rahab was charged by God's grace, and we will see how that she was converted by God's grace. And then lastly, we will see how that she was confirmed by God's grace. Let's look first at how that Rahab was changed by God's grace. In fact, real quickly, just to take you back into the book of Hebrews, or up into the book of Hebrews, and we see that the writer of Hebrews testifies by inspiration that Rahab was a believer. She believed, in fact, before the spies ever arrived. Hebrews 11:31 says, by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. James also tells us that her faith was made evident by what she did. Her receiving the spies, hiding the spies, and sending them out with a plan was a product of real saving faith. This story sets her apart from those who do not believe and did not believe. This is the story about how God saved her by his grace. It tells the story of how a harlot was changed by God's grace. She became spiritually alive. She was made alive. Think about it. She was an unworthy sinner living in a pagan city, living in an ungodly lifestyle. But something changed in this woman's life. She may have been a harlot, but that was no longer her practice when the spies came. She was living in a land that was absolutely condemned by God. She was destined to die along with all of the city of Jericho and their inhabitants. But this ungodly woman who was without strength to change her destiny had her destiny changed by God's amazing grace. Again, think about it. She was under threat of the condemnation. She was living in death and in a place of death, but God quickened her and made her alive. Isn't that our own testimony? That Christ died for the ungodly who were without strength? Isn't that what Romans 5:6 says? For when we were yet without strength in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. Weren't we once walking according to the course of this world, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind? Weren't we once foolish, disobedient, and deceived? But something changed, and it wasn't us turning over a new leaf. It was God's grace that changed this woman, and through her, her family was delivered. By grace, by God's sovereign and amazing grace, she, like the believers at Thessalonica, says that she, let me get back there, turned to God from idols to serve the living God. She was changed by God's grace. And she didn't just change for one day. She changed forever. She ended up living with Israel. She was converted, and we'll see that. And she was ended up marrying an Israelite, and she was engrafted into the family of God and more. By God's grace, her destiny was changed. Not only was she changed by God's grace, but I believe that she was charged by God's grace. Now, she was warned of the impending judgment of God upon her city and its inhabitants. She, like Noah, was moved with fear and looked for those spies. She sought out those spies. She hid those spies. She preserved those spies. Her faith and her fear moved her with courage and with confidence. She didn't know anything about God. She knew nothing, but she knew enough. God's grace had changed her and it charged her to move. Now, she does not say that it was their huge army or fierce fighting force that had instilled that fear into the hearts of her or her people. But she was no longer afraid of what men would do to her. When the king's men came and was searching out for those spies, she wasn't afraid of what they would do. She saw the promise of God and had hope in that, and she saw it being worked out in front of her own eyes. You know, it's interesting. The reason why I have that verse in Exodus, and I'll read it in just a second, she didn't know the Song of Moses. That's what that verse is, or part of it anyway. But she was a witness to the truth of the Song of Moses. Look at what it says. Then the dukes of Edom shall be amazed. The mighty men of Moab, trembling, shall take hold upon them. All the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. Fear and dread shall fall upon them. By the greatness of thine arm they shall be as still as stone, till thy people pass over. O Lord, till thy people pass over, which thou hast purposed. Rahab was changed, and she was charged by God's grace and with God's grace to act in faith and become part of the providential plan of God. You cannot explain this story any other way than that this is a lot to do with God's providential grace being extended to a Gentile woman. Now, not only was she charged by God's grace, but she was converted by God's grace. She helped to save her family. She became concerned for the souls of the ones that she loved. What did she do after that? She told the spy, she says, now therefore, I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that you will also show kindness unto my father's house and give me a true token, and that you will save alive my father and my mother and my brethren and my sisters and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. Isn't that what happened to you when you were saved? Didn't your attention turn to the salvation of others once God had saved you? If you remember, Christ told Peter once he was converted, he said, in other words, once you have recovered from your sin of denying me, he said, strengthen your brethren. You know, Peter was all concerned only about himself. That's why he denied the Lord. But once he was converted, was he already saved? Yes, just like a lot of us. But somewhere along the line, God's grace converts us. God's grace changes our path. Once we have repented from our sins, we didn't just be concerned about our own life. We began to pray for the salvation of those whom we loved. She was sure that God's grace could be extended to others who were also unworthy sinners. She didn't plead for her family because they had never sinned. She didn't plead for them because they lived a good life. They were just as much a part of that pagan, heathen, corrupt city with ugly, cruel religious practices. She pleaded for them on the basis of her own deliverance. God had showed her mercy. He included her in the covenant of mercy, and now on the same basis, she sought the same mercy for her family. Her eyes had never witnessed the things that Israel saw. Her ears had never heard the thunder and the lightnings when God was present. Her heart, though, was melted with the fear of the Lord because of what she had heard and because God's grace moved upon her. God changed her. God charged her. And God converted her. In all this story, we need to remember why the spies came here in the first place. They came for the reason, well, does it say why? To spy out the city. But God turned it into his reason and her season. It was all by providence. It was all according to God's plan. They were sent really to draw out a confession of faith from Rahab. God had already done a work of grace in her heart, but with the mouth, confession is made unto salvation. She believed, but God wanted her to confess to her conversion. What about you? Do you believe? Do you believe with the heart? Then you need to confess with the mouth that God has raised up Jesus from the dead. God did all of this for her. God delayed the entrance of Israel into the land of Canaan and the destruction of Jericho, all for her salvation and conversion. I want to tell you, if God has his eye on you, there may be a lot of things that he delays in destruction just for you. Lastly, I want to tell you about how that Rahab was confirmed by God's grace. Now, the spies had told her, if you're going to be saved, then here's what you got to do. You got to put a scarlet line, a scarlet thread in the window. And Joshua 2:21 said, she said, according unto your word, so it be it. And she sent them away, and they departed, and she bound the scarlet line in the window. She did exactly what the spies told her to do. She didn't wait. She did it immediately. She bound that scarlet line in the window on the wall. On the what? Now remember, think about this. Where in the world did Rahab live? She lived in a city that was doomed to be destroyed, and she lived on the wall of that city. What did God destroy when Israel blew their trumpet on that seventh day as they marched around that city one last time? We sing it and sang it as children. The walls of Jericho came tumbling down. Think about that. She lived in one of the most dangerous places in that city. Yet she found refuge in the most unlikely place. God confirmed her by his grace. She was saved in the destruction, not from the destruction. Imagine all of her family being gathered together in her home and seeing and hearing the crumbling of the walls. Imagine all of those family members may have begun to regret listening to her and thinking at that very moment that her home too would come crashing down, but it didn't. It stood firm. It stood confirmed as she stood confirmed in the faith and in trust to God. No matter what she saw or heard, God confirmed her faith. God has promised you. God has given you his word, and he will be faithful. Again, remember what she told the spies. I know that the Lord has given you this land. I believe, in other words, in your God, and I will act on that faith. Now, in this statement, again, she referred to God as Yahweh. She didn't use that Canaanite name for God, but the covenant name that the Hebrew people used for their personal God. All of the residents of Jericho were destroyed except for Rahab and her family. Rahab heard with her own ears and then saw with her own eyes the power of God in working in and through his people. Rahab had nothing going for her. She did not deserve to know God. She was a Gentile. She was a foreigner to the covenant between Israel and God. Just that statement alone should remind you of what Paul wrote about the Gentiles at Ephesus. He called them Gentiles of the flesh, and he said in Ephesians 2:12 that at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Verse 13, but now in Christ Jesus, ye who were sometimes were afar off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. Jump down to verse 19. Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God. She was an Amorite, part of the corrupt and vile nation that had been marked for destruction. She was involved in depraved religious practices and wicked in her own right. She, though, tasted of God's amazing grace because God set her apart, called her out, sanctified her, saved her, and delivered her and her family. God did this during the destruction of her city. God destroyed her environment, but he saved her in and from her own environment. She then became part of the covenant with Israel. She became part of the family of God and the family that was part of those who were chosen to bring the Son of David, the Christ, into this world. Imagine that. She was a Gentile, engrafted by grace and being the one that she was to give birth, not that she gave birth to him, but she was one who gave birth to those who gave birth to the Son of God. You know, there was no prophet preaching the word in this city. There was no preacher telling the people to flee from the coming judgment and to trust in God. But the messenger came nonetheless. That messenger was the Holy Spirit, who came to her, an ungodly, unwilling, and unworthy sinner, helpless. God sought her out because it was his plan of grace to seek out the unworthy, ungodly sinners who are without strength. And think about it. How amazing is that? She was without understanding. She was without the law. She was without strength. But you know what? That's part of the plan of God. Those are the kind of people that God saves. Think about it again when we read it in Romans 5 and 6. For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. Can you see God's grace in your own salvation? Christ died for the helpless and the hopeless sinner. Christ died for those who are morally and spiritually bankrupt. She was no noble. She was not righteous. She was a sinner, an enemy of God and an enemy of the people of God. But that's our story. Rahab's story is my story. And if your eyes have been opened to God's grace, it's your story too. Keep going in Romans chapter 5. For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die. But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. She was delivered from the destruction of that city, but so much more. She was included in the family of God and in the lineage of the Messiah. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more being reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. When we look at that whole story again, Rahab was changed by God's grace. She was charged, invigorated by God's faith. She was converted by God's grace and became interested in saving her family. And she was confirmed by God's grace. Her life was no longer lived in that decadent city, but with Israel, in covenant relationship with God. And she experienced the grace of God. She had to have been humbled by God's grace. Imagine that. She was blessed beyond her expectations and certainly beyond what she deserved. That's the story of God's grace. That's the revelation of God's grace. Is that your story too? I know that it's mine. What a rich and wonderful story. May God bless you, and may God bless His word.